as a gift. And even when he became a name, that was one of the things I said to him. Now remember, you're just lucky you were born with a gift. Keep your feet in the ground. And I think he did.
Oh, yes, he did. When you were driving to Stormont, or you're being driven to Stormont, and then and you saw all, and then up to Roselawn, and there were all those crowds. How did you feel about that?
It was amazing to see it. It was, and it gave me a feeling. I was sad, but I was proud. The people. And I don't know if you heard the story about it or not. That Big Jim told last night,
What?
Or his wife told, rather, Linda. As we went down the aisle, I touched Jim just on the arm. And the man beside Jim said, "Oh, Jesus. And who was it? Inspector Flanagan. He was in tears."
So many people were in tears that day.
I mean, there was a hardened policeman who had seen probably most of everything over the troubles, dead bodies, dead people, bits and pieces of bodies, and he was in tears. No, as I say, I had a great feeling of pride and the reaction of the people to George's death. I mean, that was a wet, miserable November day, and the people turned out in their thousands.
Hundreds of thousands.
Yeah, it was amazing. But even yet, I mean, we get people from all over the world contacting us by letter, or even coming. We've had people from Italy, people from Australia, people from different parts of America, and whatever. And we've had letters from Germany and things like that. It's...
He was public property, wasn't he?
Yeah, in many ways, I suppose in many ways he was, but as long as it was good public reaction to him as a person, apart even from his football ability. I mean, people liked his personality even, and he was never boastful or big-headed about himself.
George was 6, I think, when I was born. George was the eldest, obviously, followed by my sister Carol. I think there's about 15 months between Carol and George, and then I came along.
And what are your earliest memories of him?
Actually, not that many. The happiest memories that I have would be of the three of us all clowning about in the house. And George was always a bit of a character, and he was always so funny, and he was always up to mischief, and Carol and Tim used to fight all the time, and he was just a bit of a character. He was always a bit of a character with a great sense of humour.
A good big brother?
Yes, from what I can remember. I was very, very young. You've got to remember that I was only 11 when George actually went off to Manchester, so childhood memories are very vague. There are certain things which stand out, things like the time my grandfather Withers died, Christmases, that sort of thing, special occasions, but I don't remember any bad times with George.
Can you tell me a bit about when he went to Manchester? Did you have much sense of just how big all this was, what was happening?
I realised that something unusual was happening in the house. I mean, I obviously understood that George had been chosen to go off to have some trials for Manchester United. I understood that, but the thing which I remember vividly was the awful, awful sadness in the house. It was hard to describe. There was such an overwhelming sadness. I mean, there was my brother and obviously my mum and dad's firstborn child, only 15 years of age, going, for us, such a long way away. I mean, we didn't get holidays. The furthest we got was Malile or Bangor or down to my granny's wee cottage in the countryside. But for, our brother at only 15 to be going on this huge adventure, and the sadness in the house that day was it was palpable. It was very difficult.
did things seem to change a lot after that, or was it just sort of a blip in what seems to have been a very happy childhood?
Change from
the whole family's point of view?
Yes, they changed quite drastically after that, because it was within a very short space of time, well, within 2 years basically, that George hit the headlines, and our lives changed dramatically. Really, our lives then became quite public.
And of course he quickly got this nickname, the Fifth Beatle, or El Beatle, and I mean, given that the Beatles were so big at that stage, I mean, he did become a sort of megastar, didn't he?
Oh, absolutely. And it happened overnight. It happened after that game when he came back from Benfica, and he came back with a sombrero, and he had the long hair of, the Beatles style in those days. And there's a story, I'm not sure if people are aware of it, that after the game, one of the supporters from the opposition rushed towards him with was either a knife or a pair of scissors, and obviously George was horrified, but this chap just wanted a piece of his hair. He just wanted to cut off a piece of his hair. So yes, I think after that, I mean, George's life and our lives took on a totally different direction. Certainly from a family point of view, it was a very surreal situation, because we still knew him as our brother who'd gone away 2 years previously, and now here he was, a superstar in the papers daily, basically, after that.
How did your friends react to all of this?
True friends just took it in their stride. I seldom spoke about George, really. I was really quite shy about speaking about him. However, there were many occasions where people, for whatever reason, best known to themselves, obviously didn't like the fact that I had a brother with this fame, and they would have been quite difficult about it sometimes.
In what way?
Well, for example, I remember going to one of our local discos, as it was in those days, one evening, and minding my own business, just, having a dance with some friends, and a couple of people bumping into me and saying, "Oh, you're George Best's sister, you think you're something, but you're nothing but an orange bee." Totally out of the blue, and I thought, well, where did that come from? And then I didn't rise, because I was very shy and very nervous as well, and that was fine. The dance ended, the disco ended, and we went outside, and I heard someone shouting, "There she is there," and the next thing I felt this horrendous pain in the inside of my right leg, and basically, to cut a long story short, I'd been shot in the leg by an air rifle. And I remember getting home and just sitting at the top of the stairs at home and calling my mum and dad out, and I had this 6-inch in diameter bruise on my leg, and that's what the police reckon. The police reckon that it was with an air rifle, and that was totally unprovoked, because I didn't go about spouting about George. I was very proud of him, but I was very shy, and I just didn't really speak about him very much.
What about press? Did they chase you specifically? Were they trying to intrude on your lives as much as on George's?
Yes, George was top news. Everybody wanted to find out a bit more about George Best, and especially after a specific game. I say in those days, whenever in my teenage years, George was in the press for all the right reasons, and everybody just wanted a little bit of George Best, and they used to be constantly at the house, whether he'd had a good game or whether he'd had a new girlfriend. It didn't matter what George Best did. The press wanted to know about it, and they would have gone to any lengths basically to find out about it, including coming to our home and, questioning us as children. And, we were a bit naive in those days, and you didn't really think, and sometimes you told them stuff, and mind you, we learned very quickly not to.
Is there any sort of story or incident that stands out that illustrates that for you? An example of them making something up or getting it wrong, or?
The one thing which sticks with me very much now, this was not about a nasty incident in saying that, it was about a nice incident. George was in the headlines. I can't remember what the incident was, but George was yet again headline news, and our family home was bombarded by press. We used to have to sit with the Venetian blinds closed, just to try and get a bit of privacy. And I remember at that stage a young reporter coming to the door, and my mum, and it's well documented that my mum was an alcoholic, and she'd had a few wee drinks that night, and I was trying to keep her away from the press, but nothing would do. She had to come to the door, and I'm trying to keep her behind the door, and she's trying to open the door, and this young lad's trying to get information out of me. And eventually my mum, spoke to him, and words ensued, and she was very upset, and he basically turned around and said to her, "Well, what would you know? You're nothing but a drunk, and if it wasn't for the likes of us, your son wouldn't be where he was today. Now, you can imagine at the age of 13 or 14 hearing that, and I would be very quick. And in those, I've mellowed now, but in those days I would have been very quick and very defensive. And I basically told him in no uncertain terms to clear away from the front door, don't come back again, leave us in peace. And what he had to remember, if it wasn't for the likes of George Best, he wouldn't be getting paid today.
When you see all those headlines and you're so far away from him, did you feel helpless at times?
Totally. Totally and utterly helpless. And because going back to the start of George's drinking, there was the gap that, you know, we didn't have the contact that we did in the last 20 years. And you could never get hold of him. When you did get hold of him, it was just, oh, it's all right and everything's fine, don't worry about it. I think we worried about it more than he did, but it still made it very, very difficult to deal with.
Tell me about his relationship with his mum as you observed it. How did George feel about his mum? Well,
going back to our early years, as I said, you know, we just were an ordinary family. You know, brothers and sisters, we fought together, we laughed together, we had just an ordinary upbringing. George seldom spoke about mum, but I have no doubt in my mind, and it became apparent during a documentary which was made 2 or 3 years back, I think, in France, when he became dreadfully upset. And that's the only occasion that I can actually remember George speaking about mum, but I have no doubt in my mind that he carried perhaps some guilt over the fact that he wasn't here as much as he could have been. But on reflection, and it's something that we've discussed recently, my sister and I have spoken about it, during the really bad times with my mum, when Carol would have phoned George begging him to come home, he would have said, yes, darling, I'll be in the plane, you know, I'll be home tomorrow, the day after. And he didn't come for whatever reason, we don't know, but on reflection, it probably was the start of his own alcohol problems, you know, so probably my mum and George had the problem.
Did you feel cross with him at that time for not coming, or?
I didn't really at that stage, because by the time George's problem had become very bad, I was then married and I was off living in South Africa, so I was quite fortunate that I had been removed from an awful lot of that. But no, I find it very difficult to stay angry with George about anything. He just has that way of, he just disarms you instantly. He just, you know, you can be furious with him and for whatever he's done, and he just comes and gives you that smile or that wink or, okay, sis, and he just carries on as if nothing has ever happened.
So when did you start to sort of re-establish proper brother-sister contact again?
Probably about 21, 22 years ago, when Norman and I got together. Norman had no idea who I was, and it was just one evening we were watching television. There was a particular programme which I wanted to watch, and Norman said, yeah, sure, fine, and we switched it over, and it was George, and I think my mum was in it too, and Norman said, well, why do you want to watch this? I said, it's my brother, and we'd been going out together for quite some time. Anyway, it was Norman who said, well, do you never see him? And I said, no, he wouldn't want to see me. It's been such a long time. We've lost contact. I've been in South Africa. He's been off, obviously, doing his own thing. He wouldn't be interested. But Norman persisted and thought I should make a bit of an effort, which I did. And we would go off to London for shows or rugby or whatever. And practically without exception, George was always there. If he said he was going to be there, he never let us down. A couple of occasions, but nothing major. You know, maybe very loose agreements, very loose arrangements. And that's really about 21 years ago. And over the years, I'm not saying at the start it was fantastic, but we started off and we built it up and we built it up and we built it up. And we just became that little bit closer. And as he got older, became that little bit closer as well.
His playing career, of course, was over by this time.
His playing career would have been over, yeah, by this stage.
So you and Norman had re-established contact with George, but this was at a time when his life was really becoming public for all the wrong reasons. And just like as a footballer, he'd been in the headlines all the time for his football. Now he was in the headlines because of his drinking and because of the women in his life and the scrapes he was getting into. How did you feel observing all that and now being, you know, close to him again, or getting closer to him again?
I just sort of felt very, very helpless about it all, because George was his own person and he did his own thing, and you could never have tried to dictate to him what to do. I mean, he was an alcoholic. He had huge problems overcoming it. He tried everything, in my opinion, humanly possible to overcome it. And yes, I used to get a little bit frustrated with him, a little bit angry with him, but by the same token, I used to get equally frustrated with the press, because they latched on to every little story which they could, and they blew it out of all proportion. Everything was front page news when it came to George, and certainly in the later stages of his life, they forgot any pleasant things which he did do, and always seemed to latch on to the nasty things. There were good times throughout all of that. Whenever, for example, Norman and I were very privileged to have gone to his, when he received his honorary doctorate at Queen's University. We were present, obviously, with the rest of the family when he became a Freedom of the Borough of Castlereagh. So there were lots of really, really pleasant times in between all that. And by and large, a lot of that time, he had stopped drinking. One of the many times where he had tried desperately hard to stop drinking. So there were lots of good times in there as well. But however, the bad times, when they were bad, I think had a profound effect, not just on myself, but on the rest of the family, and in particular my father. He had to, sit in the house and put up with all of this, and, the press would ring, and my father's not really very tolerant of the press. No comment, put the phone down. But nevertheless, it was very, very difficult to deal with it, and the press have a way of manipulating stories and manipulating photographs and making, in my opinion, making things out to be what they're not really. I'm not saying there wouldn't have been an element in truth of some of the things, but the press always had a way of manipulating it to sensationalism.
When did your mum die?
My mum died in October 1978, at the age 54.
And how do you think that affected George?
I think it had an impact on him. I think it saddened him. There again, he didn't speak about my mum's death very much until a couple of years ago, when a documentary was made, and unfortunately George was filmed with alcohol taken, and he did become very emotional. I have no doubt in my mind that mum's death affected him. He was gone a lot of the time that she was drinking, and wasn't really a lot of support, so I have no doubt that he did feel it.
Did he look to you for moral support or anything like that?
No, during the time when George was drinking, I don't think he looked to anyone for moral support. He was his own man. He was an alcoholic. He couldn't help what he did. He tried other means of support, from a medical point of view, but certainly from an emotional point of view, he never certainly spoke to me about it, or he didn't look to me for any sort of support. I wish he had have, and I wish I could have given it, but however, it just wasn't his nature.
He'd hit the brick wall now. It was either have a transplant or he was going to die.
Yes, basically, he had no options left. He'd reached the end of the road. He was so ill that a liver transplant was the only way of saving his life. And
how do you think mentally he took that news?
On the surface, he seemed to take it very well. He accepted the enormity of what was ahead of him. He met all the criteria to receive this liver transplant. He stayed off alcohol. He seemed to be coping with it mentally very well. He seemed very buoyant, very positive. So yes, on the surface, everything seemed to be very, very positive.
And of course, there was no guarantee as to when it would happen, or even if it would happen, because you need a donor.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And unfortunately, a lot of people, and I'm sure a lot of people to this day, still think that George jumped the queue for a liver, and that's just not the case. He had to wait. It's not just a case of getting a liver. There are certain things which have to be met, certain things which have to be matched, and George had to wait just like anyone else.
Of course, you've touched on an area where there was some begrudging publicity about it, about him jumping the queue, or because he was an alcoholic, did he deserve it? Have you had a chance to stand back and think, given the experience with your mum and with George, about what alcoholism is?
I think constantly about what alcoholism is. I worry constantly about my own position. I know certainly for 5 years I stopped drinking because I was just so afraid because of my mum and because of George. At the moment, I hope that I'm one of the lucky ones. I can take a drink or leave it, but I constantly think, what causes this problem, and why is it not just so simple? Why can't they stop drinking? But the only thing which I can compare it to is trying to stop smoking and looking what George went through the last couple of years. You know, it must have been so difficult for him. So, I mean, if getting a liver was not enough to stop George, given the fact how ill he was during the actual operation and how he very nearly didn't make that, you know, I don't have the answers to it. If it was that easy, then we wouldn't have alcoholics.
What did it mean to you when George and Alex said they were coming to live in Northern Ireland?
Oh, it obviously meant a lot. We were delighted. Now, I had my reservations about George and Alex living in Northern Ireland, especially where they chose to live. They had a beautiful house with a beautiful view, but however, it wasn't quite... It was just too far removed from the hustle and bustle which they were used to. I think on reflection it was possibly another way of George coping. He needed a project, he needed an interest. It's, I think, the typical dry drunk syndrome where they need a project to keep them occupied. And, you know, if it's not one obsession, it's another. And in my opinion, I really believe George did want to come home for a while, but I think an awful part of it was anything new to try and keep him off alcohol. I was delighted to have him home. Norman and I had some brilliant times with Alex and himself. We had some rare evenings together, sober and maybe not so sober. But however, I didn't think it really was going to last, and it didn't. They went back to England.
And did they discuss with you going back to England, or did it happen quite suddenly?
It just happened. Well, I had seen the writing on the wall. You know, he was still having to fly back quite often. He still had to work. He still had to earn a salary, and I could see that it was becoming a little bit difficult for them. But however, they didn't really discuss it. We had been out for a meal one night, and literally in the middle of a mouthful of food, he said, "Oh, we're going back to London," and that was it.
How early on did you realise that this was really serious?
People may disagree with this, but this is the honest opinion of both Norman and myself. When George first went into intensive care, to the best of my knowledge, it was the 4th of October. Norman and I were in France. We got a call from Phil to say that George was in intensive care. We flew straight back from France, and it was that day, it was that evening. We visited him. We left him at about 10:30 at night, and I'm afraid the alarm bells were ringing even then. That was on the 4th of October.
How did he look?
Horrendous.